You might think that even before we start, there's an error on the screen. The Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery, and here we are at the RA. In fact, that is the correct title of the lecture series, the Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery, but tonight it's at the RA. And we're very, very grateful for you hosting us here, Vicky, and thanks to the Royal Academy for hosting the lecture here tonight. May I flank my welcome to Vicky's and tell you that the Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery is an annual lecture exploring themes relating to the National Gallery, its history, its collections, broadly its cultural impact. Tonight is the fifth in the current series, following lectures by Laurence Descartes, the director of the Louvre, the archaeologist and art historian Salvatore Settis, Joseph Leo Kerner, the specialist on the German Renaissance, and Patricia Lee Rubin, who spoke to us last year about Raphael in connection with the Raphael Centenary exhibition. It's my duty also this evening to thank the Linbury trustees. It's a pleasure to express gratitude to Lady Sainsbury, to her children, and to the other trustees of the Linbury Trust, and also to remember Lord Sainsbury, who left us last year. The Linbury Trust and the Sainsbury family continue to support the National Gallery very generously as we approach the gallery's bicentenary. Today's lecturer, giving the fifth annual Linbury Lecture at the National Gallery, is Annabelle Selldorf, the principal of Selldorf Architects, a 70-person architectural practice founded in New York in 1988. Annabelle was born and raised in Cologne, Germany. She received a Bachelor of Architecture from Pratt Institute and a Master of Architecture from Syracuse University. She has acquired a distinctive profile as an architect who has intervened with skill and subtlety in museum buildings and spaces of art. Her current and recent architectural clients include the Frick Collection, the Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego, the Clark Institute, the Hispanic Society of New York, and most recently also the Art Gallery of Ontario. 2 years ago at the National Gallery, we asked her to take on a project to reimagine the welcome at the National Gallery's Sainsbury Wing as we approach the gallery's bicentenary in 2024. Her brilliant project was given planning permission just over a year ago, and construction, I'm happy to say, is well advanced. The project has, of course, been accompanied by a certain amount of controversy, but what architectural intervention at the National Gallery hasn't been? When I asked Annabelle to give this lecture, she responded enthusiastically and immediately and said that she wanted to speak about the relationship of architecture to art in museum settings. All of us in this place, I can say without hesitation, are enormously invested in this topic, and we're very interested in what Annabelle has to say. The order for this evening is Annabelle will speak for about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. I'll have the pleasure of engaging her in dialogue for a brief period, and then we'll be inviting questions from the floor. So please think about your questions as she gives her talk. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Annabelle Selldorf to speak on inhabiting the museum. Thank you.
So if you're lucky, my computer won't work. But we'll see. No, it works. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming for this talk. It's really wonderful to be here, and what a beautiful theater it is. And indeed, how wonderful David Chipperfield's renovation of the building is. I love coming here. So, Gabriele, thank you, already introduced what I'm talking about. And indeed, thinking about art museums has occupied a significant amount of my time over the course of much of my life. I think about museums both as someone who visits them frequently and as an architect who has had the good fortune to design or work on a number of museums and galleries. I was delighted to receive this invitation, indeed, got all excited, to deliver this year's Linbury Lecture. It is, however, very intimidating to be, for one, the first architect, and worse, a non-academic, to give this talk following a list of these known and eponymous scholars and art historians. I see this as an opportunity to reflect on some of my preoccupations around museums, their role in people's lives, their opportunity to create spaces for reflection and change, and perhaps most importantly, to think about how architecture in concert with art contributes to the potential of what I consider transformative change on individuals and communities. And what is a museum exactly? A museum is a not-for-profit, wait a minute, something is not working here. Sorry. A museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible and inclusive, museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. This is the updated definition the International Council of Museums settled on after much debate in 2022. I appreciate this broadened definition, acknowledging museums' role in fostering diversity and operating with the participation of communities. I should also note that tonight I'm focusing on fine art museums exclusively. There's, of course, an enormous range of other types of museum, from natural history and science to fashion and technology, and so many more. In New York, we even have a museum of sex. In preparation for this talk, I wondered what the historic trajectory and evolution of museums has been. In fact, I asked Gabriele if he knew, and what was considered to be the first public museum. I was pleased to learn from him and then do a little research afterwards to learn that it was founded by a woman, Enigaldi Nana, in 530 BCE in Babylonia, founded an educational antiquity museum with artifacts from Mesopotamia, many of which had been excavated by her father, with some artifacts dating as far back as the 20th century BCE. And surprisingly, they included labels in multiple languages. The building was uncovered by the British archaeologist Sir Charles Leonard Woolsey in 1925 during his excavations in Ur in the Sumerian city-state in ancient Mesopotamia. A more institutionalized idea of museums developed in the Renaissance with the exhibition of private collections and cabinets of curiosities, including the 1471 private collection of Pope Sixtus IV, which led to the opening of the Capitoline Museum in Rome in 1734 for the common people's enjoyment of art. The trajectory of public museums moving steadily thereafter with the establishment of the Louvre in 1792 and many more museums growing out of royal collection opening in the cities across Europe throughout the 18th and 19th century. In the United States, it's in the post-Civil War period of the 1870s, with these first American museums. These were born from a desire both to compete with the great European capitals, but also as a way to build civic values and morals for the benefit of a young nation with new immigrants coming from all over the world, although mainly from Europe at the time. This was the period of the foundation of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, as well as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1870, along with the Art Institute in Chicago in 1893, and many others thereafter. These museums were designed in the Beaux-Arts and neoclassical style mostly, which was the typical expression of civic buildings at the time. Then, post-World War II, modernist architecture, and specifically museum architecture, aimed to be more democratic, with an expression and a vocabulary freed from historical references that were tied to notions of hierarchy and exclusivity. I was lucky, or privileged, or both, to grow up in a family who preferred going to look at exhibitions rather than doing just about anything else. We didn't go to church, but we went to see churches, and we went to museums to see whatever there was to see. Any museum would do as far as my parents were concerned. That is what I thought as a child. Growing up in Cologne, however, we frequently went to the Wallraf Richards Museum, you'll hear that name a few more times, so much so that it really felt like it was part of our daily lives. We went there and looked at all kinds of art, from modern and contemporary to old masters and everything in between. Seeing those works was not just a series of singular events, but rather a gradual process of getting to know the collection, meeting familiar pictures in familiar places over and again, and instilling the totality of the experience into the fabric of my character and really informing my perspective on the world. Reflecting on these memories and realizing how very personal they are, I thought I would share with you some observations about a few select museums that have had an effect on me and informed in some way how I think as an architect today. Bear with me. I'll take you on a little journey of some 7 museums. If you think that that's a lot, the original list was much longer. I begin with the aforementioned Wallraf Richards Museum. It opened in 1957 and was designed by the architects Rudolf Schwarz and Josef Bernhard. Schwarz was a notable architect who had trained with Hans Pelzig in Berlin and was well known for his designs of churches. Perhaps it was appropriate then that he was commissioned to design what represented the first newly constructed post-war museum building following the massive destruction by bombings of almost the entire city of Cologne. For those of you who know Cologne, the building I'm speaking of is the original Wallraf Richards Museum, which was built to house a significant collection of medieval, think Stefan Lochner, to early 20th century art. The institution was later combined to coexist with the Museum Ludwig's stellar collection of 20th century pop art, German Expressionism, as well as the Ludwig's extensive Picasso collection. Eventually, the two entities moved into 2 separate new structures, and the Schwarz building was turned into the current Museum of Applied Arts. The building mirrors the layout of the former Friars Minor convent and is attached on one side to the remaining medieval Friars Church. It's organized in 3 wings around the central courtyard of the former convent, incorporating remnants of the historic loggia. The central element and contemplative ambience of the cloister lends a particular calm away from the noise of the surrounding city and informs the spirit of the museum. Unassuming from the outside, a long, somewhat relentless brick entrance facade faces a generous open space close to the grand Gothic cathedral and across from the Cologne radio and television station. The other sides of the street facades are organized in a more vertical reading with 6 gables, which allow for an expression of north-facing sheds that provide daylights to the exhibition spaces of the gallery floors. The low-ceilinged museum entrance, modest in spirit, leads to a double-height reception hall, a welcoming and large gathering space which is bathed in daylight from the courtyard. From there, a wide staircase leads to 2 stories of galleries around a central atrium. Larger, top-lit central galleries flanked by smaller side galleries with windows. Daylight apparently wasn't of any concern in those days. Having visited as a child and a young adult, I have forever thought that the curious and lean post-war modernity of the museum's architecture, with its somewhat classical principles of circulation and proportionality, made for a perfect place to wander and allowed for places of rest and orientation. For me, these were spaces where you could encounter art at your own pace. It was a big museum, but not so big that you would easily get tired. I did not consider then that the collection was curated and presented with a particular point of view. I did not think about if the viewpoint was equitable or inclusive. Now I recognize that surely there were biases, omissions, even misrepresentations perhaps, but nevertheless, a wide spectrum of art through the ages reverberates in my memory. Consciously or unconsciously, I formed connections which I have carried forward. Seeing medieval gold grounds and Jasper Johns' flag painting in one afternoon's visit did not seem in the least contradictory, but rather formed a tapestry of narratives from very different places and times. And thinking about post-war museum, I was reminded of the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, another museum which has left lasting memories. It was conceived as a national gallery for the collection of the House of Wittelsbach. Located in a park in Munich, the building was designed by the famed neoclassical architect Leo van Klenze and opened free to the public in 1836. The Neo-Renaissance building is organized across a long east-west axis and exhibits paintings from the 14th to the 18th century with functional and almost modern logic. Through a series of proportioned and grand top-lit galleries and more intimately scaled rooms alongside with a sidelight. This is an arrangement similar to that of many other Beaux-Arts structures and was deployed as well in the modern Wallraf-Richartz Museum. In World War II, bombings destroyed a third of the building, and afterwards debate arose whether it should be demolished completely and replaced with new architecture altogether, or if it should be rebuilt to its original likeness. In 1946, Hans Dölgast, a modernist German architect, initiated a concept of rebuilding that would acknowledge the event of war and destruction. He proposed that the remains of the building be kept, but reinterpreted. His proposal ultimately prevailed, and the building was completed using brick and other material from the surrounding rubble. Its wounds were visible and unfinished, not only revealing but highlighting the area of the damage. Dölgast developed a new north entrance and inserted a pair of monumental staircases in the place of a former south loggia. One staircase leads east and the other west to simplified but relatively unchanged galleries on the first floor, thus creating a loop from one side to the other. The stark contrast between the historic architecture to the new, austere, and almost sacred aesthetic of these interventions is not per se attributable to a specific architectural style or era, but represent a unique testimony to wartime destruction and post-war reconstruction. The interventions display an attitude of how the memory of war would be kept alive and invoke a new reading of the essence of this museum's experience. It is impossible to be in the galleries and view the incredible collection, the unforgettable paintings by Dürer, Rubens, Roger van der Weyden, Altdorfer, and many others, without the intrinsic memory of ascending the stairs, inevitably being reminded of the disruption of war and culture. It colors the viewing of the works of art and leaves one perhaps with a sense of dislocation. I believe that, again, consciously or unconsciously, when we see works of art, we connect the memory with the place of viewing. This could be said of many life experiences, of course. But here the memory is profoundly imbued with the transience of history and our own place within it. I'm now traveling to Venice. Venice is one of my favorite places in the world, and the sheer endless opportunities of seeing and experiencing art and architecture in the famous city of water never fails to touch my heart with longing and sadness. Sorry, forgive me. One of the places I go back to again and again there is the Galleria dell'Accademia, a compound of multiple buildings from the 18th century, the church Santa Maria della Carità, the Scuola Grande di Santa Maria della Carità, and the convent of Lateran canons. I got lost at the Accademia every time I visit and feel the better for it, having always discovered something I had never seen before, or finding some of my favorite paintings now hung in a different place. All of this is perhaps a little contradictory given the focus for a professional on wayfinding in museums and other public institutions. However, it points to the benefits of a designed path, while at the same time allowing the freedom of getting lost, which may bring discovery. The Accademia galleries are dispersed across multiple buildings, as I said, which have been modified from their original purpose over many centuries. It's not easy to know how to negotiate the spaces, and sadly, I find that recent renovations have not really contributed to a sense of welcome or legibility. But it is the grand, inspiring proportions of spaces like the double staircase, the Sala del Capitolo, or Sala dell'Albigo, in contrast to others that are small and intimate, and the materials and details that bear testimony to the centuries of change and interventions, which make a visit with the most wonderful Venetian paintings an even more profound experience. I am fascinated by the interventions by Carlo Scarpa that began in 1944, when he was invited to reorganize the museum to modern curatorial standards. These represented a distinct about-face to the traditional museum display, with the declared aim to bring knowledge and enrichment to all visitors and to experience the work of art as part of their everyday life. The art historian Giulio Carlo Argan suggested that if art is education, the museum must be school. Scarpa's approach was to focus the eye on architectural space and separately display. He noted that listening to the artifact, whether a sculpture or a painting, can intuitively help in the decision of how to display it. He used local craftsmen trained in traditional techniques and materials. He had tapestries and other decor removed and exhibited paintings without their historic frames in pared down spaces that revealed the original room proportions. He installed sculpture in juxtaposition by means of a specifically designed display system using wood, steel, and other materials to produce a different scale and architectural context for these objects. He wanted to create a human scale along the grand spaces to establish a direct relationship between the visitor, the works on view, and the architectural setting. This contrast between the original historic structures and Scarpa's modernist aesthetic continues to resonate for me somehow, and it's something I think about when designing new gallery spaces or exhibitions, which may as often as not display art from another era. Considering how the experience of art is inextricably linked to the surrounding context and space within which we see it, of course, brings to mind the world of Donald Judd in Marfa, Texas. Judd passed through Marfa in the late 1940s and became fascinated with this isolated small town and its surrounding high desert landscape. He returned there in 1971 to stay with his young family and eventually bought a city block of buildings that originally were part of a former military base. It contained 2 hangar buildings, which had been turned into warehouses, as well as a number of other structures. These buildings could accommodate and were adapted into living and working studio spaces, with additions of defining adobe walls around the property. There was a new water pool, a pergola, and some outbuildings later on. And this complex is referred to as La Manzana, the block. The block and other separate buildings in the center of the town of Marfa are now part of the Judd Foundation, and in my mind, it is in these different-sized buildings that one gets insight into Judd's working process and his way of thinking about making art, exhibiting art, and living within art. And this allows you to really experience Judd's vision that art and life are not separate. From initially realizing spaces for his own works on a private scale, the purchase, with the help of DI Art Foundation in the early 80s, of an inactive military base, Fort D.A. Russell, and a large warehouse in the center of Marfa, Judd moved to working at a much larger scale, and he always intended it to become a public institution. It became eventually known as the Trinadi Foundation, following a split from the DI Art Foundation in 1982. Here at Trinadi, Judd exhibited his own works and that of invited artists, notably Dan Flavin, John Chamberlain, and of course others. There were 32 buildings that were a unique ensemble of architectural styles and functions on the base. Judd began by converting the existing buildings, preserving their fundamental character, but adapting them to serve his own considerations on what they should look like in their relation to the works of art and the experience of their natural surroundings. He had specific ideas in terms of their exterior appearance and their interior transformation, removing or adding to adjust for the art. At the two artillery sheds, which house the spectacular 100 aluminum boxes, each dimensioned 41 by 51 by 72 inches in 100 different configurations, he decided to add corrugated Quonset barrel walls atop the existing flat roofs so that they doubled in height, lending clarity of proportion and hierarchy relative to the other relatively undistinguished structures. Ultimately, these interventions were entirely purposeful and inextricably linked to the works of art themselves. The notion that art should be afforded permanence with installations specific to the original intention and therefore always linked to the notion of specific placement was paramount, something that went beyond the ordinary practice of museums, who are collecting and placing art in ways that he felt was disconnected from the artist's intention and their reach, and very seldom permanently installed. Almost 20 years after Donald Judd's death, Trinadi stays true to his vision and interests, a challenging task at times, as it has become an internationally known place with many more visitors and a very changing environment. The first time I visited Marfa, the experience of art installation, architecture, and the presence of distinct space integrated into nature and life to be lived was transformative for me. And I felt that that becomes part of our own narrative as we witness the generous yet insistent presence of the artist, Judd touching it all. In his many writings musing about art and how art should be viewed, Donald Judd wrote about the Frick collection. In 1962, when he commented on the specialness of the place, he offered this opinion. The books and furniture, courtyard and varied rooms provide a more congenial setting for the paintings, most intended for such surroundings, than would be the bleak rooms of the usual museum. Henry Clay Frick was an American industrialist who made his fortune in coal and steel. He began collecting art at a young age and amassed a large collection of old masters and 19th century paintings along with decorative arts. He was inspired by a visit to the Wallace collection in London, and when commissioning a new home in New York City in 1912, it was done with a long-term plan in mind that after his death and the death of his wife, the house should be a museum for the use and benefit of all persons whomsoever. The house, designed by the architect Thomas Hastings, who had just completed the New York Public Library, is located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The building faces Central Park, and Frick sadly didn't live in the house for very long, passing away in 1919, but his wife and children continued to reside there, and only after the wife's death in the early 30s, the plans for fully making the house a public museum were undertaken by the architect John Russell Pope, known for other major public commissions, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The main living spaces of Frick and his family have changed very little and are essentially arranged now as they were then, when it was a private residence. Frick placed art and objects to his personal liking, not following any curatorial point of view or art historical chronology. The quality of art in the Frick collection is at the highest levels, with its 3 Vermeers, Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, and a room of Fragonards, to name but a few. But it is comparable to any other great civic museum in its holdings. And it is the unique experience of viewing the art in a domestic setting that I think has kept visitors coming all this time. In a departure from the first museum by Annie Galdinana, there aren't any labels or other didactic material near the objects on the walls. There are occasional discrete room sheets available that will identify the painting for visitors. All of this in the spirit of experiencing the environment with purity. What makes the Frick such a memorable place for me is the intimacy and directness of the encounter with art, that is, paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, and furniture placed and living in the elegant architecture of Hastings and Pope. A private house of a time past, surrounded by gardens, everything exquisite and all in conversation with one another. We are afforded and invited to find our own path within it, to explore and take it in and take it with us. We, Selldorf Architects that is, are currently undertaking a renovation and expansion of the Frick collection that will allow public access to the private quarters of the family on the 2nd floor. And we're adding spaces for temporary galleries adjacent to the historic galleries on the main floor. The project also entails creating a more comfortable and accessible welcome for all visitors with an enlarged reception hall and accommodations for the Frick's education and research programs, expanding and connecting it to the Frick Research Library, a new cafe, a shop on the 2nd floor, as well as an auditorium below ground. The project is under construction now and will open at the end of 2024. The Frick's permanent collection was moved for public view to the former Whitney building on Madison Avenue during the renovation of the old house. This famous modern landmark, in the shape of an inverted ziggurat, was designed by Marcel Breuer and opened in 1966. We were pleased to have the opportunity to work with the Frick on the design of the installation of the collection in the building. One might imagine that placing this personal and outstanding collection of old masters and decorative arts in a brutalist building was counterintuitive. Yet the museal presentation, organized in chronological and geographic order of these masterworks, has prompted many people to comment that they feel they are seeing the collection for the first time. I wonder what Donald Judd would have thought. The exposed concrete waffle slab in the Breuer building reminds me of Louis Kahn's Yale Art Gallery. Kahn is widely celebrated as the master builder of the 20th century, and 3 museums he designed stand out in his oeuvre. The Yale Art Gallery for the expansion of the oldest college art museum in the US, located in New Haven, Connecticut, is the earliest design from 1953. Kimball Museum of Art in Fort Worth, Texas in 1972, and Yale Center for British Art, 1974 to 77, was finished posthumously just about and is located across the street from the Yale Art Gallery. It is the Yale Art Gallery amongst these that I'm drawn to most, and that I return to visit every time when I'm in New Haven. Being one of Kahn's earliest work, it seems to me that it is the clarity and the economy of means that is particularly noteworthy. Materially, it is minimal, unlike the Kimball and the Yale Art Center of British Art, which utilize more varied and more opulent materials and complex details, whereas here, an almost elemental attitude is used to create the unique character of this museum. The simple design made of steel, glass, concrete, and small brick belies its compelling rigor and intense attention to detail. It is quintessentially modern and at first glance unassuming. It stands clearly linked to the timeless foundation of traditional buildings at the intersection of 2 streets surrounded by college buildings in a variety of architectural styles. And once inside, the Kahn edition provides harmonious links to the 2 early historic buildings that altogether comprise the museum. The expansion by Kahn over 4 floors is essentially organized as a loft building with a central core of stairs, elevator, and back-of-house spaces between 2 large, open, and flexible gallery spaces. The skylit stair, encircled with a concrete silo, is designed with great attention. The experience of it is distinct and separate from that of the galleries, creating a transitional moment during the promenade upwards through the museum, inviting the visitor for a moment of respite, almost like a palate cleanser. The gallery spaces are large and beautifully proportioned. Here, the tetrahedral concrete slab ceiling and the careful rendition of daylight provide at once a strong sense of identity of the galleries and yet never intrude upon the visitor's attention, but rather create a serene and restrained atmosphere in which the wide spectrum of different art of this near encyclopedic museum always remain the central focus. Kahn wrote, "You don't know what the building is. Really, unless you have a belief behind the building, a belief in its identity and in the way of life of man." So if we can say that museums exist to bring people to art and art to people, these examples stand out in my mind as ways in which architecture provides the context for that intersection, and furthermore, how architecture can elevate the impact and meaning of the experience for the visitor and constitute part of their memory, yet also form part of the institution's or the museum's identity. What these examples all have in common is a particular attitude of restrained and unequivocal focus, here in the service of art, of course. Nevertheless, they also display confidence in the independent and transformative power of architecture itself. In other words, if these buildings were not museums, they would still resonate as places of strength, clarity, and equilibrium. Intrinsic to this is that people and their experience of the built environment is central to all great architecture and bring it to life. I wanted to quickly talk about our current work at the National Gallery and how this work has further advanced my thinking about the centrality of people and how the ways in which they use and inhabit buildings, such as museums, must be at the forefront of our work as architects. When the gallery was founded in 1824, the first 38 paintings came from the private collection of the banker John Julius Angerstein, forming the core of a new national collection, always for the enjoyment and education of all. The paintings were displayed at 100 Pall Mall at Angerstein's townhouse. It was soon clear that the growing collection would need to be moved to a more substantial location, and a new building designed by the architect William Wilkins was planned for Trafalgar Square and opened in 1838. Since then, there have been many additions resulting in the building that we all know as the National Gallery today. I could, of course, wax on poetic and at length about the breadth and quality of the collection and the beauty of the galleries. It's a museum which I have always cherished to visit. But instead, I would like to address the efforts that the National Gallery is putting into making its building truly welcoming and accessible to the widest range of visitors possible on the occasion of its 200th anniversary. Along with our partners, Purcell, we are honored to be a part of the NG200 project, which entails a series of architectural interventions that are not intended to change the galleries themselves, but rather to allow the institution to better serve its audiences and education and research mission. With annual visitors approaching 6 million, that was pre-COVID, but we're closing in. It has become evident that the steps of the portico and the interior in the Wilkins building could neither be made universally accessible nor any longer accommodate those numbers. The on-grade entrance of the Sainsbury wing, designed by Venturi Scott Brown Architects and opened in 1992, is the appropriate main public entry for the gallery and invites visitors to start their visit beginning with early Renaissance works of art at the Sainsbury galleries as they arrive atop of the grand stair. Our task has been to transform the entry situation at the Sainsbury into a transparent, welcoming, and engaging space. Eliminating an underutilized courtyard at the western edge of the Wilkins building has yielded a new square within the public realm of the greater Trafalgar Square, which articulates the inherent relationship between the Sainsbury wing and the Wilkins building, creating a more visible and a more defined entry into Sainsbury. A new security vestibule will make entering easier and greet visitors with daylight crossing the space east-west and open to a connected mezzanine. We're also achieving a new connection below Jubilee Walk, allowing visitors to move in a continuous loop through the building, eliminating the need to double back through galleries to exit. The research and education program is being enhanced with expanded and renovated spaces, as well as making room for new supporters' amenities. The National Gallery provides free access and outreach programs that enhance the opportunity for an ever-widening population to experience art. To better understand who the gallery's visitors are, we undertook a robust engagement exercise with the public on the topic. With the leadership of our partner, Kaizen, we surveyed people, held discussions and workshops on what made people feel comfortable in public buildings, not exclusively museums. We wanted to hear not just from people who regularly visited the museum, but maybe more importantly from those that didn't. We needed to understand what the barriers to entry are for many people, and perhaps not surprisingly, but a little humbling nevertheless, to an architect, we learned that the most important aspect of that which makes people feel welcome in a building, the nation's museum in this case, is not what it looks like, but how they are welcomed, who greets them, and if they find within people who look like them. The National Gallery has taken this on as part of this project, including adjusting their visitor service and security training to provide the most comfortable and welcoming experience possible. The architectural work enables those efforts, and we believe our work is setting the gallery up on a positive and forward-looking path. We're dedicated to creating an environment that will provide moments of orientation, transition, and refresh from the exterior public realm all the way to the art in the galleries. I'm very excited by the construction progress and look forward to the opportunity for you all to experience it yourselves in May 2025, when the first phase of the work is completed. But to think about the future of museums, we can see today that the future of museums is under pressure from many angles, from climate change, from changing expectations of visitors around participation and agency, from lack of consensus on public funds to support programs, from deteriorating infrastructure in older buildings. The list goes on and on. I'm not naive enough to think that passion or architecture alone is going to shore up those vulnerabilities. But I hope that a sustained collective commitment to museums will increase everyone's understanding of their role in creating a more humane, equitable, and civilized work that is welcoming and accessible to all. My thinking about architecture in general has evolved as a result of working on the National Gallery and the engagement process, but also as a result of the work we are doing at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, which has a robust external engagement process focused in particular on Indigenous communities. On this project, we work closely with the Indigenous architect partner Two Row Architects, and conversations with them and the Indigenous circles have broadened my sensitivity and empathy and made me more conscious to what the many perspectives and personal histories bring to experience. I recognize that the work we do impacts people deeply and impacts people from very different backgrounds other than my own. Architecture through the ages has always held itself responsible to reflect society's values, and the reorientation and widening of those values has made the imperative to listen and internalize other points of view all the more critical and necessary today. Architecture and the future of museums will be the better for it. Thank you.
Do you want to have one of those?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Annabelle, for a spectacular journey that took us from Eningalda Nana's museum, or Cradle of Civilization, right to that upturned ziggurat in New York, and via so many other spectacular examples. And thank you also for making it such a kind of personal journey. I guess one's always astonished at just how resilient museums are right from the start. And you listed some of the challenges that we face in museums right now. No doubt we'll get through them in some manner or other. But the museum has been there right from the very, very beginning, from the origins of the city right up to today, and continues to kind of fascinate us as a format. We live in it, we work in it, we visit frequently. We're astonished by what we see in museums. We're astonished by what we experience as we enter these amazing buildings. Quite often they are the locus for the most imaginative, the most brilliant architecture of our time. I guess I wanted to really begin. I was struck by the sequence of slides that you showed us, because in every slide you were subtly drawing attention to the way in which light enters the buildings and the way in which the building's interior responds to the conditions of the exterior, and the way in which light illuminates the experience of the art that's shown within it. When we were first talking about your involvement at the National Gallery, you were talking about the National Gallery as a welcoming beacon, and you described very much you described the National Gallery project very much in terms of the way light entered the building, the way light exited the building, actually, and the way that drew in the public. So I wonder if you could say something more about the way you think about light in these spaces and what the impact of light in these spaces brings to the experience of the art shown within them.
I could talk about that for a long time. Fundamentally, I think that light helps us find our way. And by that I mean not literally wayfinding, but it reminds us that we are in a live place. And it's been very interesting, for example, at the Frick, to negotiate with the conservators how much light we can allow in the galleries. The West Gallery in particular, of course, has phenomenal paintings, and we weren't allowed to have 28 foot candles anywhere. Nevertheless, we were able to negotiate with glass and layers of different interlayers, an atmosphere where you can tell what the time of day is and what the atmosphere outside is without having a direct view of the outside. And I think that it's very important for the well-being of a person to ground themselves. I also think daylight happens to be very beautiful and sort of helps us in the consciousness process of putting ourselves relative to the art or with the art. I have a painting, a very funny, interesting 17th century painting that I found in a house that I bought, and I had it painfully restored. And it is in a place where most of the time it looks like it's all dark. A few times a year, the sun comes into the building in such a way that all of a sudden you really appreciate the barnyard that it is. And you can see, the mice on the ground, which are usually just in darkness. And every time I think, this is so beautiful. And it's an appreciation, and maybe also a sense of time that plays a role in that part.
It's very interesting to consider whether some museums sort of take you to another place,
right?
And some museums give you a stronger sense of the place in which the museum finds itself. Some museums sort of close out the outside and want to take you to a very particular aesthetic experience, and others want to allow the sort of urban space, the city space, to bleed in, or the landscape to bleed in. There's lots of different formats, and we've worked in quite different places. I mean, think of the different kinds of light and different kinds of spaces and the different kind of relationship to outside spaces that you've had to deal with in Arles recently in your Luma project, or La Jolla, for goodness sake. Think of the comparison between La Jolla and San Diego, and bleak London weather in Trafalgar Square, and how you navigate those differences in the buildings that you're shaping and the experience of people visiting those spaces.
I think it's tremendously important that we know that we are in this place, and this place is unique. Ubiquity is something that I try to work against. because I think it helps our memory, our sense of self, and the identity of a particular museum to locate the specific place. In La Jolla, it was actually very, very difficult to keep enough daylight out because it's so intense, the Southern California light. But it contributes when you are looking under those circumstances at Southern California art, you have a completely different understanding of how it came to be. It came to be because of that light. And maybe that's a little bit, when I think about Donald Judd, is the specificity with which he addressed his own works and the place where he produced these wonderful aluminum boxes. They couldn't be anywhere else. They can only be there, and they stand relative to light, to the nature, to the architecture.
I haven't visited Marfa. I'm really excited to go. To begin with, you were talking about the way in which we see works of art in the museums, and then as you came on to the National Gallery project, you started talking a lot about people and the experience of people in museums. Who are the prime consumers of museum architecture? Is it consumers? I'm not sure if that's even the right word. Is it the works of art, or is it the people who visit?
Well, I think it's the works of art.
I mean, think of Carlos Scarpa. In a way, you don't really need people in a setting like the Verona Museum or the Academia. It's just so perfect and so beautiful on its own. You hardly need the visitor.
Well, I guess that's my argument is that some of you who know me will laugh. I always say that architecture is the mother of all arts, and so a great building is a great building is a great building, and it could be other things. But then when you place art in it, and that's what I think is so beautiful about the Kahn buildings, is the weight changes. The architecture isn't in the way. The architecture does exist on its own, but it's not competing with the art. And you make room for art because you love art. And so at the end of the day, I think architecture is for people. And in the best of all places, architecture invites you to encounter art and do that in a very singular way. Yet I know later on, another month later, you'll remember that you've been in a building that's helped you, that resonates with you and that resonates with the experience of the art. Like, I don't know, I'm sure that your head is full of memories of paintings that you've seen in particular locations, and the two of them are forever together, even though you, as a scholar, you know every aspect of the painting. But in the best of circumstances, you remember the place and who you were relative to all that just as much.
One of the points that you made was the way in which museums kind of carry their history with them. They're sort of container of history, but they are a constituent part of the history of a city or the history of a nation. And you were pointing out how the scars of the history of the Munich Alte Pinakothek are very evident on on the structure of the building itself, on the surface, on its facade. This notion that museums sort of contain history, but carry their own history with them and become part of a bigger historical narrative, which is the narrative also of the people who live in the place.
Well, I think that every museum has something of a unique DNA, and it comes from different places. And I think as a museum evolves, ages, grows up, all of the events that happen in and around that museum somehow or other are part of its character. And sometimes that is more articulated, and sometimes it's more subtle. I mean, we know so much about the history of the National Gallery, how many layers of changes over time, and I basically just said that Wilkins did the building that was opened in 1938. There were others who consecutively did things. You took us through where all the courtyards used to be, and then they were changed, and again. And then many of you will be aware of the story of the various competitions around the Sainsbury wing, and it's an interesting thing to consider how you can make modifications to a building, but I don't think that you can take the soul out of it. And some of the controversy around our intervention at the Sainsbury really left me thinking about, are we doing the right thing? And the changes are considerable. They really are. But now that the initial phase is complete, you can see how the building, maybe this is also controversial, becomes what it wants to be. And I think that big stair was always there for everybody to go up that stair. And now it can do that, and now it can be seen from the outside. And now there is a real entrance that celebrates the fact that it is on grade, so everybody can walk in on grade. Everybody can come in through the same front door. And there is room for people. There's room for somebody to sit and wait for their friend, their cousin, their mother, whatever. And people who cannot walk up that very steep stair can find the elevator. And I think that's what the building always wanted. And I think when it's all said and done and a few years have gone by, it's not that I'm that modest, but I think it will look like it was and is the Venturi building that it always was.
That was exactly where I was going to take the next question, but you've given your initial impressions of what it's been like to work on a very important and distinguished building. But I think this is the moment to open up to questions from the floor. I'm sure there are plenty of people waiting to ask questions. I can just about see the audience, and I can already see somebody with their hand up over here. Can we bring a microphone down to... Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for it was very interesting. I was thinking during your lecture, what would be more difficult or challenging or enjoyable for an architect, whether it's creating a new space as a museum. Then you have the other option, which I think is the most controversial with the public, which is adapting an existing museum and creating an extension. That's always going to bring, high discussion. But I was also thinking, I kept thinking about the Reina Sofia in Madrid or the Tate Modern here, buildings that were completely something else that have then turned into a museum. And thinking about the Reina Sofia, when it reopened in the 90s, I think it was, or late 80s, I can't remember, and it had the most astonishing outside, you know, the glass elevator, which is so remarkable. And yet you walk in and you still feel like you're in an old hospital run by nuns. You have that kind of, you think you're in it's got that a little bit of a monastic, and it houses one of the most modern paintings. So it's, yeah, I wanted to ask you, what would you find more enjoyable to do if you were to choose?
I'm not going to tell you that. No, there isn't a simple answer. One doesn't want to be known as the architect who sensitively intervenes with somebody else's work. On the other hand, I firmly believe that buildings deserve to be carried forward into their next life. So both are true. If there is a necessity for a new museum, I'm available.
Thank you. There's a question there in the middle.
Thank you very much. You talked about the research that has been done on how people use museums and public buildings, and indeed why they don't come. When you have done a project, a whole building or an intervention in an existing building, and it's finished, and you hand it over to the client, are you sometimes surprised, I hope in a good way, by how the public end up using the building and perhaps taking it in directions you did not anticipate?
It's a very interesting question. It's also a difficult one to answer because I think so much depends on what I mentioned during the talk, that if people are invited and feel welcome, they are more likely to engage. And truly a profound experience for me was when a museum where we did a renovation, the Neue Galerie in New York, when it was finished, after, I don't know, 4 or 5 years of construction, I always thought, well, it looks very nice and art looks great. But I didn't imagine that anybody would see any of the details and any of the thinking that had gone into making the corners meet like this, and I don't know, whatever the detail might have been. And shortly after it opened, I happened to be walking behind some people who were visiting, and I overheard their conversation, sort of saying like, I really like the art, but my God, this building's really beautiful and the way it's come together. And it was, not only did it make me feel very proud, but I also realized that it means so much to do something for sort of a wider public, and to realize that, of course, it's true. Everybody sees things and notices their surrounding. They don't just always talk about it.
That's a question down here. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the sort of format for your talk because, of course, it makes you think, oh, well, if I was giving this talk, which museums would I choose? I expect we're kind of all thinking that.
Should play a game and ask everybody in the audience.
But you said sort of at the beginning that you felt that, the kind of the context for art, the spaces that you're in, is related to how well you remember the works, like the sort of, and of course that applies to life itself. I was just thinking about kind of more recent museums where perhaps the idea of sort of generic space seems to have taken hold. That is, that the architecture is kind of supposed to disappear and kind of, you know, give the floor to the art. And if you compare that to the sort of 19th century museum, where you really have rooms for art that are treated, that I suppose take their cue from domestic spaces, rather than, you know, the kind of 20th, 21st century museums, which are more like kind of industrial spaces for art. I just wondered how you feel that that sort of impetus for the architecture to kind of disappear or be neutral, how does that change what you were saying about the kind of, you know, our relationship to the art and the extent to which we really remember it and it becomes part of our experience?
I think it doesn't exist, neutral architecture. For the better part of my life as an architect, I've worked on many contemporary art galleries. And people say, oh, you worked for this gallerist and for this gallerist. And why does it make a difference? They're all white cubes. But and it can't be that hard to put a bunch of cardboard walls up and a ceiling and some lights in it. But it's not that hard to write a book of 100 pages and just fill them with whatever story. Every single thing has to be considered, and everything has to do with proportions. And sort of the idea of neutral space, in my mind, equates ubiquity. And of that, we have so much, right? Every shop looks the same. We have a pret-a-manger across the street from my office, and there's a pret-a-manger across the street from the National Gallery. I eat the same thing whether I'm in London or whether I'm in New York. And it's a little bit that. Do you know what I mean? You may not think about whether or not you're engaging space, but you always are. And yeah, there's a little bit of subtlety to that. You could tune out the space, maybe. You could like walk around like that.
There's a question in the middle here, and then we'll head north.
Hi there, thank you for the talk. You obviously have a great sense of pride in your work. What's the worst thing a client could do once you've handed it over? Because presumably you've still got a vested interest in its longevity and how people appreciate it for many years to come. So what's the worst thing a client, i.e. the person sitting next to you, could do once
like a trick question, actually.
once you've handed it over, with maybe some specific examples in the past of who's done what?
Oh, nothing bad's ever happened. I don't know. I can't really bring anything to mind right away. I'm sure I would if I thought about it for a bit. But I think the worst thing that happens is that somebody doesn't bring care and sensibility to the space. And what that means is that there is a degree of legibility. You call that pride, but it's a great deal of effort to think about how dimensions come together and how circulation works and how light enters a building, how structure has a sense of logic, etc. And it's the disrespect to those kinds of things, that is a shame to perceive when that is brought to a space. Like the Neue Galerie, for example, who is now over 20 years old. Every time I go there, I think, wow, these people really love that building. They take care of it. They make sure that the floors are in great working order, and that it's a real thing. And maybe it's easier to give you the opposite example.
Over there, and then Nick on the left.
I've got almost the opposite question to Vicky's question. It struck me, looking at your selection of museums, that Carlo Scarpa is somehow in a different category to the other architects, because Carlo Scarpa is both the architect, the museum designer, and arguably the curator. And I wanted to ask you if you think it would ever be possible now for an architect to have the depth and quantity of influence on the display of art that Carlo Scarpa had, and if so, would you want to have that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's very interesting to think about. I am, like probably most architects, I want to do everything all the time, and from time to time you have to confront that you can't, and you have to be considerate that that's a reality. Can it be done? Absolutely. Is it a good thing? I don't know. I mean, I think it's actually interesting that Donald Judd had opened an architecture office. As far as I'm concerned, he is as far as anybody can be from being an architect, because every single thing he did in specificity to his work of art. And it wasn't the consideration of a sort of larger context. And that's in no way critical, but everybody can build a house if they want to. They can say, I want 2 windows there, and I'd like the door this big, and access to the bathroom this way. So that in itself doesn't make architecture. I think that things happen in layers and with hierarchies. And Carlo Scarpa is interesting because I sometimes think that his way of approaching things, everything had the same level of importance. Right or wrong, I mean, admirable. I don't know that I can say much more than that.
But your question brought to mind that famous description of John Evelyn visiting Rome and saying he visits the opera, and it was Bernini who'd designed the stage sets. It was Bernini who'd written the music. It was Bernini who'd performed on stage. It was Bernini who built the opera house as well.
That's right.
Nick.
Actually, I was going to ask about Carlo Scarpa and what you'd learned from Carlo Scarpa, because as my eloquent companion here said, it struck me in the presentations that you made that there was something very distinctive about Scarpa's response to, as you put it, separating art from architecture. And I wonder whether you could talk a little more about your admiration for Scarpa and also where the limitations are in his approach, or that of Lino Bobardi, for instance, in Maspe, which was a very similar way of thinking about the relationship of building and art.
So many people think of Scarpa less as an architect and more as a designer, because he was so active in all ways, working with glass and intervening in existing buildings. To me, what was so interesting, or continues to be interesting in the academia, is the appreciation of, no surprise here, light and proportion. And in my mind, those interventions are the ones that I'm most interested in. He then accessorizes the building and the experience of art. And I don't always agree with that, but of course he was so incredibly commanding and sensitive that you can't pass by that, if that makes any sense. There's so many moments, haptic moments in the academia. Like when you enter, there's this unbelievably beautiful, it's not really a terrazzo floor, but it's a terrazzo made with cotto. And now, 60, 80 years later, it has indentations because where people walk, the surface is different. But there's never a moment when I go into that building when I just think, this is just the most beautiful contribution to the building. And maybe it's the intrinsic quality of his contributions that I am so interested in. And that's the same really for Louis Kahn. Everything is considered, but none of them are in a way calling attention to themselves, or I don't know how to say this better. We'll pursue this.
Let's have one more question. Maybe two.
First, thank you. I have two questions. First, can you say something about what do you think of museums being free or having to pay to go to museums, and what that would do to the future of museums? Two, listening to your talk, it occurred to me art has changed a lot from the period you've started showing museums, but museums haven't. So kind of disagree with what you're saying. We still see art in the same way, but the art itself has changed so much. Is that still, are museums still the place to see them?
Well, question number one first. I think it's wonderful that you can go to the National Gallery and spend hours, if you like, and you don't have to pay for it. Sooner or later, somebody has to pay for it. And I don't know enough about how funding works. I've heard people say that the cost of employing people to sell you a ticket, etc., is so great that it's not worth it. But that's not really true, especially the more digital ticket sales become. But that's not where the cost lies, right? So it really is something that is difficult to talk about, other than it's a wonderful service to the visitor, and it's very hard to think that if we want to bring people to museums who cannot, for a variety of reasons, that they ought to pay $30 to enter. On the other hand, they pay $30 to go to the movies. So the second question, I think, is one that is being tossed around. There are museums for installations. I was in Hong Kong not so long ago, and the latest Herzog Demeron Museum is so huge that you could put, I don't know, truckloads of installations in there. And yet it is void of any personality whatsoever. And it's a beautifully built, interestingly conceived buildings with fabulous surfaces here and there, but it doesn't feel like, if I were exhibiting there, I wouldn't be able to say, I want to be in this room or in that space. And yeah, that's an ongoing ongoing conversation. I don't think that every museum should be everything to every type of art or I think trying to find a DNA for a museum is important.
Let's have one more question and we'll draw the evening to a close. Mary.
Thank you. Can I bring you back to the Sainsbury wing? You could say that Venturi Scott Brown's architecture very much draws attention to itself, and that interior in particular was a very carefully wrought ensemble on all floors. My question to you is, it is quite a major change on at least 2 levels of the interior, but then the main staircase and the top floor, the beautiful galleries are the same, and then the lecture theatre and the temporary exhibition space is also the same. Are we going to be entering 2 separate buildings, do you think? How are you going to link them together while making them obviously very distinct?
It's a wonderful question, and it is one where, number one, I do think it will feel continuous and like one building. I really do think that in 30 years, how people enter and utilize a building has changed very much. And over time, the carefully orchestrated spaces that we are changing have not fared so well. And we can debate probably a long time why that is the case. I sometimes speculated that they had more program to fit in those 2 little floors than one would gracefully be able to do. And we've modified the program to accommodate more grace and more engagement and interaction. But that's not what you asked. Is it going to feel like a different building? I honestly don't think so. I ask myself that question all the time. I'm definitely not a postmodern architect, but the team, all of us, have debated a great deal, and I feel that this intervention is in the spirit of supporting the building and making it better. And I really meant what I said. A couple of years in, nobody's going to remember that this was actually changed, and hopefully we'll just come and spend time.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for the journey you've taken us on. Thank you for being with us here in London and helping us to think about our own architecture, the architecture that we live in, the spaces in which we show art. Just picking up on that observation about free museums. I mean, the National Gallery itself, you can visit throughout the year. You can see it in different light conditions. You can see the different ways the curators hang the pictures. It's a sort of living, breathing experience that we've grown up with, and most of you here will have been visiting frequently for many, many years. And so that sense of being, very engaged with a collection, being very engaged with a building, experiencing in different circumstances, different light conditions, in different moods of your own, of course, is what makes the experience of museum visiting so rich and so rewarding. And we're very fortunate to have a spectacular group of museums here in London all around us, and so many of them visitable for free. They really are our museums. They're the museums that we've grown up with, the museums that we live with, and the museums that we'll pass on to our to future generations, to our descendants. And thank you for being part of that with us. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Annabelle.